Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Our next speaker is Jim Marrs. I think most of you in the audience know Jim, but just a few words about him. Jim is the ultimate consummate researcher. He is a nothing but the facts, ma'am, Joe Friday kind of guy. He's a best-selling author. Amongst his works, of course, Alien Agenda, still the #1 selling book of all time about the alien phenomena. The movie JFK, of course, based on his work. One of his early achievements was to break publicly for the first time the story about the government remote viewing program. Yeah, he was the guy. His first book was Spies. But what happened with that book was that it was bought up by a publisher. The publisher then chose to shelve the book, not release it. And that kind of kept the lid on that program sealed shut for a few more years. But here's what Jim's done. He has just re-released the book Spies, and it is greatly, greatly expanded. It's expanded with new work, new information, and really, primarily, it's expanded with stuff that he had for the first book but didn't include. Guess why? Because it was too far out, even for Jim at that time. So guys, you are in for a treat. The first time the world is going to hear this information. Welcome our friend Jim Marrs.
Thank you, Bob. I'm blinded here. Is there anybody out there? Yes. All right. This is great. All right, before I launch into my presentation, I want to share a little bit of news with you all that I think you'll find hopeful and gratifying. A lot of you, we've been here off and on for a number of years, and I know that each and every one of you has faced the snickers and the ridicule of your friends, neighbors, friends, and/or family. And so I want to tell you something that I think is quite encouraging. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we've turned the corner on UFO disclosure, but I want to tell you that from what I understand, I think we are at the corner. According to some sources I have that are pretty well piped in, have proven reliable in the past, some of you may have heard about the meeting that was held at the United Nations last week. This reason this information has slipped out is because it's been authorized to slip out. Apparently there has been a decision made up at the upper echelons at the level of MJ-12 or whatever they might want to call themselves, something of that equivalent, that it is time to start releasing credible information as to the reality of UFOs and their occupants. Now, I don't believe this decision has been made entirely voluntarily because what we have is like the O'Hare Airport incident. This year we've started right off with incredible sightings in the Stephenville area, which is only about 65 miles southwest of where I live. Kept going out on my porch and looking for that mile-long craft, but I never saw anything. But so I think the decision was been forced on them. They were meeting with representatives of other nations. Russia particularly is upset and getting paranoid. Gee, I can't imagine why, just because Bush is trying to ring them with missiles. And we were briefing other countries to prepare their populations for the reality of UFOs. generally the discussion went along the lines of, well, we think that most people will be okay with this. The problems are going to be in fundamentalist Muslim countries and in some fundamentalist Christian countries. The Catholic Church, of course, has already been conditioning their people. You have Father Balducci, who has said, yes, there are people on other worlds, and they are God's creations, just like us. So I think that you're going to see increasing sightings, increasing reports, and we already are beginning to see a turnaround in the perception of not only the public, but the media. The surprising thing to me about the Stephenville sightings was not that they saw a UFO. People have been seeing UFOs since time immemorial. And not the fact that the Air Force changed stories in midstream. First they said they had no planes in the area, and then 2 weeks later, after all these witnesses kept coming forward, they backed up and said, we made a mistake. Let's set the record straight. We had 10 F-16s flying in the area. They never said that's what the people saw, but of course that's the inference they left. That in itself is really wild because, let me tell you something, it takes a lot of bucks to fuel and to man and to fly an F-16 fighter, and I've never seen more than 2 at a time. The idea that there were 10 F-16s up there just does not ring true to me. I don't think you're going to see 10 F-16s in the air short of World War III. But they did have to explain that there were planes in the air because too many witnesses had seen F-16s chasing this huge object that was estimated to be maybe a mile in length and a half a mile wide. One of the speakers yesterday said a flying Walmart or a flying aircraft carrier. It's amazing to think what kind of power source you have to get something of that size in the air. No, none of that was surprising. The surprising thing was the response and reaction of the public and even the news media. They just weren't buying it, this idea of F-16s. In fact, in the Dallas Morning News, one of the most arch-conservative papers in this whole country, there was an opinion piece, and they're saying, well, why is the Air Force changing their story? Something's fishy here. What are they trying to cover up? So it's starting to come around. So those of you that have been hanging in there all these years, just hang in there a little bit longer, because I think between now, 2013, and on up into 2015, 2017, and maybe even a lot sooner, even the densest of your associates and friends, relatives are going to start going, gee, there's something going on there. But let me give you a warning through my own experience. Don't for a minute expect these people to come back to you and say, gee, you know, you were talking about that 10 years ago, and you were right. Ain't going to be happening. Now, the pundits who today and a few years ago were on TV snickering and saying UFO reports and roll their eyes, they're going to be on there saying, I've learned today that UFOs are coming, and they're going to be, you know, it's like I knew it all along. And your friends are going to be going, you know, I always knew there was something going on there. You know? So, but that's the way the world works. All right. Today, I'm going to be talking about remote viewing aliens. Now, most of you have already know about remote viewing, so I'm going to skim through the background of that pretty quick. Oh my goodness, there's a very youthful Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, and as you know, they were the ones at Stanford Research Institute along with Ingo Swann who did all the preliminary work and did all the preliminary studies that produced remote viewing. Remote viewing, by the way, for some of you that may not be that familiar with it, remote viewing is not the name of the activity. Okay, it's a psychic activity, a predominantly right brain activity. Remote viewing is the name they put on the techniques to achieve this psychic ability. And actually, you don't achieve it, everybody's got it. This was the amazing thing about the work done at SRI was they proved two things. Number one, that everybody they tested had the ability. Now, that's like saying you and I both have the ability to play Chopin on the piano. Well, yeah, but yours is probably much better than mine. But the point is, if we study, if we learn music, and if we practice, yeah, we can both eventually play Chopin on the piano. So we all have this innate ability. Some obviously are a little bit more naturally gifted and they can do it a little bit better than others, but we all have it. And two, and this is the really amazing thing, is that this ability of psychic viewing is not limited by time or space. They did studies with Ingo Swann where he and another fellow went out and remote viewed Jupiter. And they came back and they said, well, it's got a slight magnetic field around it, and it's also got a small ring around it, and it's also, we see mountains and cloud cover and everything, and this was in the early 70s, and everybody just put it in their file. Because how do we know if that's true or not? But by the late 70s, when the Voyager space missions went out there and began circling Jupiter and began sending photographs and data back, they found out, oh, it's got a little ring around it. It does have a weak but nevertheless present magnetic field. And oh, it's got cloud banks and big mountainous areas under the clouds. And this is called feedback. The feedback was good. The feedback showed that the remote viewing was correct. And so as they progressed, all this ability then was, which originally was funded by the CIA, then passed into the United States Army. And at this little place here, these had been a baker school during World War II, and it's on the grounds of Fort Meade, Maryland. And this is Remote Viewing Central. And it's really amazing. The story is incredible. If you don't know about this, I would encourage you to get my book, Spies. It'll give you the overview, not only of the remote viewing program, but of the history and the scientific research, and all the way back to the Bible. We see that people have had this ability all throughout history. So they were able to lay on a cot at Fort Meade, Maryland, and cast their minds out and actually walk the halls of the Kremlin. One of them told me he turned a corner and there was a guard standing there with a machine gun, and he just about freaked out. He said, oh my God, he's going to see me. What am I going to do? Am I going to have to fight him? You know? Then he had to stop and remind himself that physically he was not there. He was there mentally. Some of the people who were in on the original Spy unit, as I call it, Psychic Spies, Joe McMoneagle, Dave Morehouse, Paul Smith, Skip Atwater, Mel Riley, Lynn Buchanan, and there was a number of others. One thing that you might want to be aware of is that these were the ones that held in there and actually did the work and basically graduated from this program. There was a lot of people initially who were brought in, but for one reason or another just couldn't handle it. Maybe because of their religious beliefs or their upbringing, or because they just didn't want to go out that far into their mental capabilities. And that's because once they got into this and once they were able to go out and transcend time and space, their vistas opened. They became much more than just military intelligence officers. This is just a chronology of how the program progressed. One thing very interesting about it was the fact that when it came time to get funding, and they were funded through 4 separate administrations for a period of over 25 years. So when they say, well, we didn't get any much good out of that, bourgeois, somebody got some good out of it because they kept getting their funding. And one of the ways they did this was to, instead of having a flip chart and trying to explain to everybody how it worked and, try to convince them to believe what they were saying, they actually took these generals and they took these politicians and congressmen and they sat them down and they got them to do it. And once they had done it, and they say, holy cow, this really works. So then they got their funding. The military went through a series of name changes, Grill Flame, Center Lane, et cetera, Stargate. So some of y'all have heard these various names, and it's actually the same program. What they discovered too was that they weren't the only ones out there looking around mentally, because in fact the whole remote viewing thing actually began as a reaction to the old Soviet Union into psychic research that had been done behind the Iron Curtain. In Russia they called them the extrasensors, and we called ours the remote viewers. And this was all done in an effort to get away from the baggage that the old term clairvoyance carried. They were already getting a lot of resistance from people who said there's no such thing as psychic ability, so they came up with these less provocative names, and they would cross each other. They'd go different places, and they'd run into their Soviet counterparts, and then they'd run into them. And at first, it was kind of like, there's the enemy. But then pretty soon they realized, well, we're not here in body anyway, so there's nothing we can really do to each other. So they just got to looking at each other, and pretty soon it was like, hey, how are you? You know. Anybody remember the old Warner Brothers cartoon where at the very beginning, the sheepdog and the wolf or the fox, and hey Bob, hey Fred, ching, and hit the time clock, you know, and then they go and start chasing each other. It was something along like that. But we also know that there was another weirder, stranger aspect to remote viewing. To the best of my knowledge, none of the military remote viewers were ever officially tasked to go look at UFOs. And that makes sense, because how could the government, who for 60 years maintains there is no such thing, turn around and tell their highly experienced and trained remote viewers, go look at UFOs? Can't do that. But they would have them go look at other things, and on the way, they'd come across UFOs. If they were tasked to go into the upper atmosphere, look for high-flying, high-performance aircraft, and they go up there and they take a look at it, and as one of them told me, he said, well, I took a look, and he said, but it wasn't the Russians, and said, it wasn't even us. Said, those guys were not from the neighborhood. Now, this is something you might want to keep in mind. Every single military-trained remote viewer, at one time or another, had firsthand direct knowledge of the reality of UFOs and non-human intelligences. Now, some of them today will talk quite readily about that. Some of them will only talk hesitantly about that, and some of them won't talk at all about that. But they all had this experience. And I think this is another reason why they wanted to keep the lid on the story of remote viewing. Not that they didn't care that we knew that they could do this remote viewing, but for the fact that it would lend even more credibility to the reality of UFOs. They also discovered other strange things. For example, in 1993, when the Titan IV rocket lifted off with a military payload, it just got to about 110,000 feet and then blew up. And they tried to blame it on a rocket motor segment malfunction, and yet Colonel Frank Sterling, who headed the project, said that an unidentified object apparently struck the Titan at an altitude of 110,000 feet. Well, what kind of unidentified object? Well, one of the remote viewers took a look at it, and others did, and they described it as a buckyball. A Bucky named after Buckminster Fuller and his geodesic dome houses, because this was a multifaceted object about the size of a hand grenade with a mirror-like surface, metallic, silver gray, multifaceted, very hard, crystalline structure. And they saw several of these floating around up in orbit. And if we put up a communication satellite or a space shuttle, well, then they just floated there and everything came off all right. But just as soon as we tried to put up a military payload, these things, one of them would drop out of orbit, come down, hit it, and just blow it apart. And then you get a little bitty story buried back in the back of the newspaper that said, well, the launch they sent up last Tuesday, they lost it. Lost it? Come on, you don't lose anything up in orbit. There's something like 12,000 pieces of space junk floating around up there, including a screwdriver that was dropped by a Soviet cosmonaut, and we know every single piece of that. So how can you say they lost something? Well, they were taken out. And this, of course, has given rise to the theory that we are in quarantine. And judging from the headlines, maybe that's appropriate. Certainly, I don't know if I'd want to go visit a world that is any more violent than ours. But so it even gets stranger. They begin to take it upon themselves to go look at esoteric targets, UFOs, if you will. Pat Price, a former police detective, was one of the early people to sign on. And he apparently was one of the best natural psychics that they came up with. One day he came in and said, "Hey, at home, nothing else to do. I did a little remote viewing study, and I found 4 alien bases on the Earth, and they're all under mountain. Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees, Mount Iyangani in Zimbabwe, Mount Zeal in Australia, and Mount Hayes in Alaska." Well, the people in the unit scratched their heads and said, well, that's nice. They filed it away. How do we know if that's true or not? That's just a story. But then, a few years later, and Pat Price had died, and Skip Atwater had taken over as the executive officer of the unit, and one of his assignments was to task these remote viewers occasionally with exotic targets. And he happened to remember Pat Price's study, so he dug it out of the files, and he had several of these viewers go, and of course they were not told where they were supposed to go look, but they were given the coordinates that represented these 4 alien bases on the Earth. And lo and behold, they all came back and said, "Wow, we found a base, and there's non-humans working there, and they're under these mountains." And they even got even further explanation. The base in the Pyrenees was like the train station. As they came and they went out of there. Okay, and this is really interesting because when I was in southern France, there was a big mountain that kind of sticks out all by itself before you really get into the mountains of the Pyrenees, and it's called P.S.I. And the sky would be perfectly blue and clear, and everything was nice, except there's always a cloud hanging over this mountain, you know. And I asked this professor that I was with, I said, who lived over there and had been studying in that area for some time, I said, why is there always a cloud hanging over that mountain? And he said very nonchalantly, "Oh, well, that's where the ships go in and out." Oh, okay. So that is just where they come and go. The base in Zimbabwe is a maintenance facility. That's where they go for repairs and, I don't know, get their batteries charged, whatever it is they're doing. The base in Australia is a R&R base. They saw several different types of ETs there, all having a good time and relaxing. And of course, I've got a picture of the Star Wars bar. Dun, 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 dun. Everybody's having a good time. And then under Mount Hayes in Alaska is a geophysical monitoring station where they track the weather and pollution and whatever's happening on this planet. Now, what's amazing to me about this story is not so much the story, it's just a story, although, as Skip Atwater said, when these other viewers went and looked at the same thing and got the same information, then he said that confirms that these bases exist on the Earth. But to me, that wasn't the amazing thing. The amazing thing was that he actually got up and said that in front of a group in Laughlin. I think it was one of these UFO conferences. And there was a huge crowd, just like you folks sitting out there, and everybody listened, politely, and then they all got up and left, and there was no report of this. There was no media report. There was no media presence. There was nothing. Nobody's ever even heard about this, and yet here was a decorated, retired military intelligence officer from the United States military who says he confirmed that there are 4 alien bases on the planet. Journalism 101. Isn't that a story? you know. But that's assuming that there really is a news media, and forget that. They all saw these craft of various types, and then more importantly, they saw the various types of races that we all are already now pretty jaded on. We all pretty well know this. You've got your little short grays who apparently are more like, I don't know, biological robots. You've got your taller grays who apparently do the thinking for the shorter grays and do have a little bit of their own autonomy. You've got your blonde Nordic types that generally are thought to be the Pleiadians. You've got your reptilians, which is still a iffy deal. We don't know about them. A lot of people think that they are hostile to humans, and yet there's a lot of information to show that that's like saying that Europeans are hostile to humans or Hawaiians are hostile to humans. You really can't pin any one attribute on a whole race or a whole group of people. The analogy I always use, and y'all might use this yourself when your neighbors start becoming aware of the reality of UFOs and their occupants, and they say, well, are they friendly? Are they enemies? Just point to an airliner going overhead and say, there's people in that airliner, right? Yeah. Are they friendly?